this panel is about one of the priorities that Rob talked about, which is misinformation killing us? And just for setting the definition, misinformation is incorrect information, but the person sharing it does not know it's incorrect, whereas disinformation is incorrect information that the person sharing it knows is incorrect, but shares it anyway. So Rob, why is this such a huge priority for the FDA?
Well, the way I think about it, in what I think of as the good old days, although they weren't so good for a lot of people, there was a hierarchy of information sharing. Companies worked on products, they sought approval by the FDA, the label was adjudicated, and then the information was passed on to the learned intermediaries, the doctors, the pharmacists, who then talked to the patients. Of course, about 60% of the patients were completely left out of that system, we've now learned, but it felt comfortable. Then, with the ubiquity of the internet, the world changed. The minute the FDA makes a decision now, there's a cacophony of people with opinions about whether that decision was right, what it means. And there's a subset of people with reach of the entire internet who are selling alternatives on the internet. And also, unfortunately, there are state actors that are purposely undermining our major institutions in the U.S. So I don't know what could be more important to federal institutions than trying to bring order to this. I'm not saying anyone knows what the order should be at this point, but we got to keep working on it.
I think a perfect example of this was at the very height of the pandemic, when in New York, people were dying and being put into trucks that were serving as morgues. One of the hospitalists, Eric Burnett, said he was going to turn to TikTok just to take his mind off things, and was shocked at how many people thought that death from COVID was fake and passed it on through TikTok and other social media. And he personally started this campaign and, has a lot of followers, but there is, I think, a complete unregulated source of information, and it's not just the pandemic. There's lots of myths that have led to terrible decisions, including the recent decisions about abortion, which we'll hear about later, and the safety of drugs like mifepristone, and, laws that are allowing intervention even when women's lives are threatened. I think this is one of and this idea of overturning a decision on a medication that's been on the market that's actually safer than aspirin or Viagra is another real threat to the FDA. And hopefully Jack will talk to us about that. You want me to use this instead? Okay, fine. Sorry about that. So, we have a fantastic panel today. And I think we want to start with, thinking about mistrust of science and medicine, and what does that portend, and how do we combat it? So, without further ado, we want to take advantage of our in-person panelists, and Claire Wardle, who is on the slide. Rob, you want to introduce folks?
Yeah, I guess we'll just go down from here. Rahul Arora from OpenAI, but also a former professor of epidemiology, so this is a great combination for this panel. He's worked on evidence synthesis and worked with the World Health Organization during the pandemic. Claire Wardle is on the screen there. She's a professor of the practice of health science, health services, policy and practice at Brown with my recent colleague Ashish Shah, and one of the leading journalists who first called attention to this disinformation issue. Next, we got Michael Drake, who's president of the University of California, and has been president of a number of things, but also former faculty at UCSF and an ophthalmologist. Jack Resneck is next. He's immediate past president of the American Medical Association and a professor of dermatology at UCSF. And then finally, Nirav Shah, who's been a great colleague, principal deputy at the CDC, and formerly head of the Department of Public Health in Maine.
All right, well, we have a lot to discuss, so we'll get going, and we'll try and have a little time for questions, so be thinking about what you might want to ask. So, Rob, why don't you start with the first question?
Yeah, we'll start with a softball question. This is mostly for the academics in the group, I think, but the question is, what is the role that people who have credibility because of your institution within your own organizations play in amplifying disinformation? What's fueled this, and what could possibly stem it?
Michael, I think we should start with you.
Great, nice to see everyone. And our organizations like ours, universities like ours, have as a principal product knowledge. We create knowledge through our research. We disseminate that knowledge through our education, and the knowledge is continually evolving and being modified and changed as it's being both, again, created and disseminated. And our job has been to filter that knowledge as we create it and disseminate it, to make sure that there are checks and balances to it. There are mistakes, there are missteps, there are directions that turn out not to lead to places that we didn't think they were going. But our job has been always to filter and to modify those things as they move forward. And we have to then be trusted in that knowledge. The professors, the teachers need to be trusted by the students. The scientists and researchers need to be trusted by the body politic. And the way that we have worked to be trusted is to make sure that we behave in a trustworthy fashion. And we have to regulate ourselves to make sure that we continue to build trustworthiness as information and knowledge comes forward. So there's always been that need to have trustworthiness as a foundation, and then trust, and then being trusted messengers for moving forward. So that's been great. What we find is that there are pressures on us that can tend to sow doubt when we are inaccurate in what we profess, or when there are things that we share that have to be retracted and we don't get to that in time, or the inaccurate information is in the headline and the retraction is on page 5 in a sentence days later. We can sow distrust in our organizations, and we, I think, have to be very active in continuing to push forward the need to make sure that we are behaving in a trustworthy fashion and creating that trust. And one of the things that's a challenge, I was in a conversation a couple of days ago with a politician. I don't know if any of you have been in conversations with politicians. It's an interesting experience, and one of the things that they do, and I appreciate, Robert, your introduction of me was something my dearly departed mother would have appreciated. You said, I hadn't heard that before, that I've been president of many things. It was an interesting introduction. But one of the things that happens sometimes in these conversations is that someone will make a statement, and most of it is mostly true, but there are parts of it that are not true, or not true at all, or misleading. And it's a challenge, if there are 5 or 8 or 12 points in a paragraph, to pick out those things that aren't true and really focus on them and make sure to say, but wait a minute, that's not right. And we find that in doing those things, it creates a bit of confrontation, and we tend to often be confrontation averse. So we kind of roll over things and allow these bits of inaccuracy to be woven into a conversation as we're moving forward. And I think it's very important for us to be vigilant at making sure when we find things, or when we hear things, or when we're in conversations where things are not accurate or true, that we really focus on pointing those things out, trying to keep the record as clear as we can be moving as we move forward. 2 final things I'd say. We've always had an emphasis on protecting a marketplace for ideas so that we could have active discourse and discussion on issues as they were coming forward. And we have to make sure that we continue to do that now. That's a challenge for us, that different points of view have to be shared. One of the issues in higher education lately is that there is too much of an echo chamber on some issues on one particular set of beliefs or one particular way of evaluating the world, and we have to make sure that we're not an echo chamber of our own biases and beliefs, and that we allow other ideas to come in, and we continue to work on those ideas. And then I guess I'd want to say that we have this first do no harm vow, and the concept of not doing harm. It's great when not doing harm is something we can be passive about and say, great, we're not going to do harm. But when we find disinformation and misinformation, I think we have to be actively engaged in trying to clear the air and focus on the verifiable facts that we are basing our decisions and opinions on, and make sure that we intervene and we lean into those things. We can't sometimes just stand back and be passive and not really address those things that we see that are inaccurate or that tend to lead people in the wrong direction. So I think that being active, leaning in, sharing the truth, continuing to verify those are things we need to continue to do.
Michael, I can't resist asking one quick follow-up question, then we'll go to Jack. Do you think we found the right place in this last part you just described? There's some contentious members of your own faculty in your university that sometimes personalize attacks in ways that are very highly personal and many people regard as destructive, and yet you got to balance that. I think we all understand with the fact that you have to have a marketplace of ideas. That's your mission. So do you really feel like we got the right balance there?
It's a good question for Jack, too, but Michael, you first.
I was going to, fourth and two, I was going to punt. No, I think that, you know, that we have to be, I think, willing to engage in the difficult conversations. And part of what I was alluding to before is when we avoid the difficult conversations or the uncomfortable conversations, which come before us from time to time. As we avoid those, we leave the problems that led to those uncomfortable conversations unaddressed. And so I think it's unpleasant, but I think we have to lean in and be involved in those discussions. And I think the balance is not quite right now. I think we have some cleansing to do, and that's going to require effort that may be uncomfortable.
Okay, thanks, Jack.
Thank you for the invite to be here. Fun to be on this panel. You mentioned Michael being president of a lot of things. I was realizing as we walked up here that he came on as Dean of Admissions for the med school here just as I was being admitted as a medical student 30 years ago, so thank you for letting me be a doctor. So I'm going to go back to the Commissioner's original question a little bit before I get to what I think we should be doing as a profession and as universities, and talk a little bit about this softball question of our responsibility as a profession for harm we have caused in this space. And I think in my year as AMA president and leading up to that, it really pained me that some of the loudest purveyors of dangerous disinformation were a small number, but a real number of doctors and healthcare professionals. And we saw just how much damage a small number of people could do. And we know that was fueled by the politicization of the pandemic. It was fueled by decades of good science education being drummed out of elementary and secondary education. It was fueled by social media allowing things to spread so much more quickly. And we know that some of these folks actually were able to monetize this disinformation, and that it looked fragmented and random, but that it was highly centralized. There was one study that looked at 1 month of disinformation about COVID vaccines and anti-vax posts, and 2/3 of all of them could be tracked back to a group called the Disinformation Dozen. So we're really talking about 12 people, some of whom were healthcare professionals. This is not new, as troubling as it is, and as much as it came to the fore in the pandemic. I was looking, AMA's been around for 176 years, a lot of complex history that we've been reckoning with lately around race and a number of other things where we've done harm. But one of the things looking back that I'm proud of is AMA was really founded around debunking junk science. There's actually, over 100 years ago, a group in the AMA, this kind of not a great name, but it was called the Propaganda Department in 1906, that was actually all about combating unscrupulous medical claims. AMA had its own lab for testing junk medicines, and JAMA was a big part of publishing those studies. And as Laura said, this is not limited either to the COVID pandemic today. We saw disinformation wielded against work by the profession around reproductive health care and abortion. We saw it around gender-affirming care. We saw it around health equity when we had neo-Nazis outstanding in front of hospitals, particularly on the East Coast, but everywhere, protesting doctors who were doing health equity work. So while it was so troubling to see this small number of doctors responsible for this, I also would just close this out by saying it was also some of what I was most proud of, looking at some of the profession's work during the pandemic around disinformation, because while, and that includes a small number of leaders that had a national presence, and we're on CNN all the time, and we're testifying before Congress, but it also includes individual frontline physicians in their practices every day, building trust with their patients, how painful it is for them, right, to have your patients who have trusted you to deliver their baby, to operate on their brain, all of a sudden trust their Uber driver or their Facebook post more when it comes to vaccines. But people do trust their individual physicians. So the work they were doing on social media in their communities actually warmed my heart in a tough time.
So, Claire, how does the journalism community sort of regulate their own? What's the process for rooting out people who are spreading disinformation? I'm sure that most journalists, work hard and are trying to provide good information, but in the effort to say, oh, what's the countervailing viewpoint, always getting a countervailing viewpoint, that gives credibility often to groups that should not be given credibility. What's going on in your profession, and how do you think we should frame that?
So firstly, thanks so much for having me. I'm sorry I'm not there with you, but yeah, for journalists, this is really hard. And before the moment in 2016 where people became obsessed with mis and disinformation, journalists would often say, well, that's not on us. Like, our job is truth. Like, our job is not to go around debunking information. But it became increasingly clear as the problem grew that journalists did have a really important role to play. But what has become clear is that journalists, as a paradigm, believe more sunlight is a disinfectant. So journalism has this fundamental belief that, well, we actually investigate and we pour sunlight onto the problem and people understand it. But that has been weaponized by bad actors who sit in 4chan and Discord servers with not a very big audience and understand that in order to give oxygen to their rumors and their falsehoods, they need mainstream media coverage. So they've actually looked to target journalists or to encourage journalists to debunk their rumors. But we've now seen journalists over the last 7 or 8 years understand this, what we call the tipping point, which is actually there are some rumors that's best to ignore, that actually giving them that oxygen is what they're seeking. But at the same time, we can't ignore this. So Pizzagate is a classic example. No journalist in their right mind thought that they should debunk the idea that there was a child trafficking ring happening in a pizza restaurant when there wasn't even a basement in the pizza restaurant. But by failing to debunk it, it actually led the man from coming from North Carolina and opening fire. So there is a challenge for us, those of us who work in this industry, to understand when is it responsible to debunk? How do we debunk in a way that doesn't actually give additional oxygen and legitimacy to these rumors? And that has been the challenge. And I just quickly say, I think the problem we had around the pandemic is that many people who were trained in fact-checking had come from the political science perspective. So not only have we always had, journalists, a few numbers of journalists with good science backgrounds or specifically medical backgrounds, that's also the case with fact-checking spaces. So there is a real need to pull people with public health and medical expertise into the fact-checking and journalism world in order to really understand how to talk about these issues and how to make sure that they're not doing more damage.
So social media has been a megaphone for misinformation, and Claire, in our pre-meeting, I think you commented on, what really fuels the flames for this and how it really gets started. Maybe you could start with talking about that and how it's weaponized, then we can go along the panel and talk about how we address this in our various organizations.
So social media companies are, and you're all sitting in the state that many of them were founded, are businesses who every quarter have to make more money. And so for that reason, I think one thing we have to remember in all of these conversations is that people, all of us, have emotional relationships to information. So those disinformation actors who are trying to amplify those messages understand this isn't about facts. This is about emotion. How do you make people scared? How do you make people angry? How do you make people feel smug? If you make people feel something, they are more likely to spend time with that content. When I read a BBC article, I don't feel anything. I feel informed, but I don't feel a visceral reaction. Whereas disinformation actors understand the mechanics, the infrastructure of these social media platforms that are built on wanting us to feel, wanting us to carry on doom scrolling. And so the problem with so much misinformation is it makes you feel something, whereas the facts, the debunks, don't have that same relationship. But it's the infrastructure of the platforms that are our weakness here, because the more we feel something, the more likely we are to spend time on those platforms. And disinformation agents understand that fundamentally, and that's why we have this kind of mismatch and uneven playing field.
Well, let me bring Nirav in and then Rahul on this, because Claire, I think you made a great point. And one of the reasons, among many, that between my terms at FDA, I spent time in Alphabet was to try to understand this. And I completely subscribe to what you just said. But we have a whole series of judges who are telling federal agencies that you can't emote emotions in your communications. And it sort of refers back to the good old days. There's been a view within FDA that we put out a press release that has the facts as we see them, and then the world should embrace those facts. But those with the other point of view are using memes and all sorts of other tools which are attractive to people because they're emotional. And the one time we did it, which was the famous "you're not a horse, you're not a cow" ivermectin tweet, we've lost at least the first reading on that in court. And the judge specifically said, you're not supposed to be doing this. Mm-hmm. So, Nirav, at a time when we know that communications for the public are driven by this emotive content, what do we do?
First of all, thank you, Rob, and thank you, Dr. Esserman, for the invitation to be here. Rob, if it's all the same to you, I'm probably not going to comment on a court case in which you and I are named defendants. So I'll probably just give that one a wide berth.
I'll jump into that one later.
Yeah. What should we do? It's easy, I think, studying this topic to come away with some modicum of fatalism, that things are universally bad and that solutions are difficult. And what I'd like to do is sketch out a counter narrative to that, because there are very tactical approaches that can be taken to rebut or blunt the effect of a lot of the misinformation we see. And I think fundamentally, the approaches to date and the generation of that fatalism relies on two things. One is that it forgets one phenomenon and then it puts too much credence in another. The phenomenon that it forgets is confirmation bias. That is to say, there's a strong and satisfying demand among those who consume incorrect pieces of information for this information. It makes them feel like the world makes sense again, because those in their tribe and in their community have hinted, either through fear or loathing, that something's just not right with those vaccines or those genetically modified organisms. And so when they see something that seems authoritative, that fulfills that need, it becomes very satisfying. It resolves that cognitive dissonance. The other phenomenon that much of the current work is predicated on is an information deficit model. The notion that if we simply put out more information, we would cure the incorrect information. And we essentially treat a lot of these conversations like a high school debater would. You've all been at a dinner party where there's that person who just won't let something go and won't stop until you say, fine, you're right. Right? Have you actually changed your mind? No. You'll just say yes in order to get it to stop. So in my post, coming back into the introduction of the vaccines, in my former world, at a state level, my former boss, the governor of the state, gave me one mission, which was to get our state, the state of Maine, as highly vaccinated as possible. And we knew we had time before the vaccines came out. And we knew that they would be rife with misinformation. So we stepped back and devised an approach from the world of what's called street epistemology. which is a non-threatening way to open up a channel of communication in order to eventually change beliefs. And street epistemology works through two fundamental principles, or two fundamental steps. The first is to take the conversation away from an adversarial model. All too often, we go into these conversations with the goal of correcting the other person, face to face. Street epidemiology changes that, epistemology changes it from face to face to shoulder to shoulder. It starts like this. Hey, you seem to have really studied this topic, and you've come to a completely different conclusion from me, and I've also studied this topic. That's really interesting. I'd like to take a second to talk with you about how the two of us who have studied this really important topic could arrive at completely different conclusions. And all of a sudden, it's not adversarial. It's two people stepping out of their adversarial roles to analyze a problem from a different level. It gets us out of that reactant mode. I'm smarter than you, you're dumb, let me give you the facts and correct that information deficit, and then everything will be okay. That's stage one. The second stage of street epistemology is where you introduce an actual discussion. You start with the proposition, the vaccines are killing people. And you ask people a simple question. On a scale of 1 to 10, or 0 to 100, how much do you believe that proposition? Is it a 70, a 6? Where do you come down on that? And no matter what someone says, your next question is, okay, so on a scale of 1 to 10, you believe that vaccines are killing people at a 7. Why not an 8? And it's in that moment when you're asking people both to rank order the intensity of their belief and contend with why they don't believe it at a 10, then you can introduce other narratives. You can say, for example, well, hey, that person that you got that information from, you know, they're saying it for their own financial benefit. They're making millions of dollars on their website. And so if you know that, does that take you down to a 6? Right? You're no longer trying to correct them. You're trying to solve a problem as to why two very intelligent people have come away with the same issue from radically different perspectives. And that's the approach we used time and time and time in Maine. And if I may be immodest for a second, Maine ended the primary and first round of boosters with the highest vaccination rate of any country, of any state in the United States. And if Maine were its own standalone country, we would have been the 4th most vaccinated country on the planet. And so there is a lot of misinformation out there, but by using deliberate techniques to get people on board, you can really turn the tide.
All right, well, Nirav, how come we're not winning it? Yeah. Quick answer, then we're going to go to Rahul. So why aren't we winning it now?
Well, here's the problem with this approach is that it is exceedingly time intensive. A lot of folks have very thin beliefs about things like vaccines. Folks have very thick beliefs about like which car to buy, right? People spend an inordinate amount of time researching what car to buy, but they spend a very thin amount of time on things like vaccines. And so it's very easy for folks just to settle on something where the stakes aren't that high. Everyone in my tribe thinks vaccines are bad. Cool, done. So having this conversation to unseat those thin beliefs is exceedingly difficult. We spent 10 months. I mean, I was on the radio, on town hall meetings. It is exceedingly time intensive. There's an adage of the internet, one of the modern laws of the internet, which is that the time that it takes to refute BS is tenfold higher than the time that it takes to generate BS. So it's doable, it's just exceedingly time intensive.
All right, Rahul, you worked with the WHO during the pandemic trying to correct mis and disinformation, but when it's really about emotion, really, what's OpenAI trying to do, or what is possible with AI, or is it just not going to be the solution as we just heard from Nirav?
Yeah, lots of really good questions here, and thanks so much for having me both. On the AI points, a couple thoughts here. Look, in my view, the role of AI is that it can introduce new strategies to address misinformation that we may not have thought were entirely possible before. because they were too labor intensive. And so maybe not replacing this sort of street epistemology type of approach, but making it cheaper, making it easier, making it more possible. And I want to talk about this briefly in terms of the two key capabilities that I see these systems having. The first is in terms of being able to process information on a scale that would be intractable for humans, and second is to adapt content on demand, and share a couple of initial thoughts on both sides. So on the first side, on information processing, one of the things that I did back in my academic work was to use these sorts of tools to automate large parts of the systematic review process for evidence generation. And one of the things we offer at OpenAI is these tools called GPTs, which are sorts of custom versions of ChatGPT, which you can feed, a different purpose, sets of information to ground their sort of evidence. And you can imagine making one based on vetted medical journals, where you can input content, and a system says, hey, this is or is not consistent with some of the information. Or you can imagine using this as part of this street epistemology process to say, hey, let's elicit a couple of different possible responses that you might have to somebody in this situation after you've asked them, why is it not innate? On the adapting content side, I think that the example I gave is perhaps one that relates to adapting content as well. But there's a couple of dimensions of this. I think one is, we deal with pretty technical and jargony content on a day-to-day basis. And making this sort of content readable and interactive in ways that meet audiences where they are. Second is, I think that there's interesting potential of AI-generated images and videos on this front. Yeah, it's something to maybe explore later. Rob, I don't know what you think about the efforts to do visual labeling for naloxone. It's a really labor-intensive thing to do if you were to AI generate a first draft of a visual label for human review. That's something that could make this process a bit quicker. And then also personalized messaging for different demographic segments. Say we have an RSV vaccine 2023 for the first time. Kids under 2 can get it, adults over 65 can get it. What's the messaging that each of those groups need to hear? And so, look, OpenAI is a technology company. I'm not going to pretend that we have all the solutions here, and my colleagues on the panel are the experts on what the best ways to approach this issue are. But the question that I'd ask of the other panelists is, what are the most effective strategies that we know to work that we can't pursue because they're too resource intensive? And then let's see how we can make those a bit more tractable with AI.
All right, so Jack, I'm going to turn to you because, again, what do you choose to respond to? And then Michael, we're going to come to you. So what do you choose to respond to of all the things that are up there? How can some of these tools maybe help, as an adjunct, help you?
Well, this is hard. This is going to be a long-term journey and a long-term battle with forces behind disinformation. We wouldn't be here today if this were fixable quickly. So I think we need to steady ourselves for being in it for the long haul. AI, I think of AI in this space like I think of AI in clinical care, right? It's just another tool. It can be used for really cool new applications that will help, and it can be used to do harm, to create new disinformation and disseminate it more quickly. And some of the tools you don't know till you deploy them, which category they're actually going to fall into. So we need a lot of smart people thinking about that in advance. When I think more broadly about how to counter voices of disinformation, let me maybe answer this in 2 categories. The first of which is, how do we up our own game? How does the public health community up its game to be more strategic and more effective? And we have now seen examples of this. So if you look at some of the people who do research about how things spread in social media and the different nodes that connect to each other, when you look at early anti-vax stuff in COVID, right? It started with this small, long-existing anti-vax community. And then all of a sudden you had connected nodes to fascist groups and hate groups and all these other groups and it just spread like wildfire once you had multiple groups. Meanwhile, you look at the public health node and it's like in the graphs, way off by itself, not connected to as many things. We have gotten way more sophisticated since 3.5 years ago. I think in for those of you who are from California, right, we had a legislative battle a few years ago about getting rid of personal belief exemptions for vaccines for children to go to school, led by a pediatrician in our state legislature, Richard Pan. Richard's kids were getting death threats. They lived through an awful mess. But Richard helped with folks from UCSF and Stanford and other places, and they actually put together a data war room that was monitoring in real time what was going on in social media. And they could actually study as they went. Which times does responding to a certain piece of disinformation give it more oxygen and cause more harm? Which times does it actually shut it down? So I think we have a lot more work to do about learning what's effective. The other piece is, I still believe, speaking of the courts, that there is a role in policing disinformation to some extent while still protecting our First Amendment rights and protecting the open debate as a cornerstone of science and medicine. We have no interest in policing that open debate, but when we have things that we know have been demonstrated to be false, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, et cetera, we know, for example, so what are some of the things we've been trying to do to accomplish that? Number one, protecting state medical boards and specialty certifying bodies and their ability to police this. Again, we are not talking about people who put something controversial on social media. We're talking about people who are knowingly spreading information that is harmful to the public health. It's interesting, this is still going to be fought out in the courts because the Supreme Court many years ago said that actually state medical boards can police, the threshold for free speech is different and that they have higher rights to basically police speech in medical encounters. It's not yet decided whether using your credentials in social media, in videos, in books, and other things as part of the practice of medicine. So that'll get fought out. We're briefing in the case that's now called Vivek Murthy versus Missouri. I think it's Missouri. It was Missouri v. Biden. They keep changing the name. But this is the case about, as Rob mentioned, what are the rights of federal agencies to actually be able to even engage with social media companies and traditional media companies when they think the public health is at risk. So I do think there's a very important role for the profession to play in protecting that ability of the federal government to police disinformation when it is that threatening to the health of the nation.
So, Michael, in thinking about, we are training, you train, what, a third of there's a huge group of people, undergraduate, graduate programs. Is this going to lead to a change in how we teach people about fact-checking, about using tools like AI, learning how to be stewards of good information and guarding against, disinformation, or helping to push this narrative that, eventually there's going to be a price to pay for disinformation?
Yeah, we've seen the price to pay for disinformation. In the hundreds of thousands of people in this country that died based on things that they could have done differently. I'm just thinking about this and listening to the panelists, and it's a big problem. And you mentioned the 10 times harder to disprove that. I think that's a dramatic understatement. The lies are much easier to believe than the truth. And in fact, you manipulate the lie so that it's as believable as you can make it, and there's no end to that. And we see that. And one of the parts that puzzles me, I will say, is that what do we do in the circumstance where there are people in a discussion? You were mentioning people having different levels of belief of a certain point of facts to help them get to a conclusion. We know there's circumstances where no matter what the facts are that line up, they're still going to believe the thing that they believed when they came in. In fact, we've all been in a circumstance where you have someone who believes something that's factually untrue, and as you add more information, show them more clearly how untrue that thing is, they believe that thing that they came in believing even more strongly. And it's because they're more interested, I think, in having their point of view be right than they are in coming to a reasonable conclusion. So, I'd say the threat that we see more broadly, I don't know, I should poll the audience. I won't, but poll the audience, but to poll the audience on how many people believe that the election was stolen in 2020, just as a thing. And then you'd say, well, gosh, there are 100 million people who would tell you that that's true. And what is it that they believe, or what makes them think that that's the case, that makes them hold so firmly at that? And then that they will follow up that belief with actions and their votes in the future and everything else that will tend to put us into a different place. So I think it's there's a real challenge. I'm going to go back to where I started at the beginning and say, first I'll speak a quick thing about AI and then the future. I think that, again, we have to all be engaged. We have to be critical thinkers. We have to not allow these things to just happen around us, but we have to be engaged in trying to get to outcomes that we believe are the right outcomes. In thinking about AI, I like I was at a conference a couple of years ago where we were speaking about the concept of augmented intelligence rather than artificial intelligence for the A, so that the A was things more like in our cars now we routinely have lane departure warning things that say, gee, you were thinking about turning or changing lanes, there's maybe a reason that you want to rethink that, rather than the car driving itself necessarily. I think there are lots of ways that I'm hoping that as we are becoming more facile with the use of AI, that we find ways to improve our ability to make good judgments as we move along, rather than giving up the responsibility of being good stewards of facts and making those good judgments ourselves.
Yeah, that's great.
I love the one, that was a great...
So, Claire, I want to ask you about, whether or not I think, and then we'll go back to Rahul on this, because, there's an issue about paying for content generation. And a lot of social media has shifted where the investment is. So a lot of journalism outlets and local journalism outlets have either died or not invested in science journalists. And is perhaps the inability to train our science journalists, or having the resource, other than the New York Times or the Washington Post or the LA Times, is this part of the problem? And how do we also help? I mean, are these tools perhaps most important, augmenting information, or checking on it, most important for a group of people that maybe are not as expert in trying to learn to be expert?
Yeah, so thank you for bringing up journalism, because I think it's often ignored in these conversations. There's just a focus on platforms, but we've got a significant problem with local journalism in this country, in many countries, real local news deserts, where there are many people in America who simply no longer know a journalist, don't have access to a local newsroom. And to your point, yes, the New York Times is doing well, but when we think about the number of major newsrooms now that are behind a paywall, it's increasingly difficult for people to access quality, good information. Our research is behind paywalls, newspapers are behind paywalls. So there is a real challenge here of how do we really work at the community level to ensure that community information needs are being met. And that does mean having more local journalists who are listening to their communities, because this has come up in the panel conversation, but it's all about listening to people's questions and concerns. And if we, when I say we, I mean academics and doctors and government spokespeople and others, if we did a better job of listening and responding to people's questions and concerns, I think fewer people would be being kind of recruited by disinformation actors who are very good at listening and are very good at weaponizing search engine optimization and are very good at saying, oh, I see you're worried about this. Here's a really simple solution or answer to your question. So what I would love us to see is really, and of course there is not more money now at the local philanthropy level being pushed into local journalism, but I want to make sure that as we do that, how are we ensuring that the listening to communities, and the examples from Maine are just beautiful. How do we really listen to people's concerns and teach one another about how to have those conversations in a way that resonates? And that's about investment and resourcing and time, but there's no shortcut to this.
Well, I also...
Can I make just a tiny comment? And I just want to echo the importance of that and of local journalism, and say that actually we have a program now at Berkeley, one of our campuses, which takes 40 fellows, and these are graduate students, postdocs, and puts them into local communities to work with local journalism to try to keep it going because of just the thing that you mentioned, everything being done on a national level and losing those people in the communities that are doing the reporting. I think that's a critical point. I just wanted to emphasize that.
And you know, one of the resources, there's this new initiative called Press Forward that is started by the MacArthur Foundation, the Knight Foundation, and their goal is to raise $1 billion to invest into local journalism. And this may be, we should talk to Jennifer about this, but this may be a really important area that could sustain this kind of effort, because again, when you don't have a local resource, people don't necessarily, the people who are believing in disinformation aren't going to trust the New York, they're not going to be reading the New York Times either. They don't believe in the New York Times. So Rahul, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I know that there are issues about, in the consumers of information, if we're generating information, we also want to help support, how can we use this also as a way to sort of the work that's being done by OpenAI to also make sure that they're supporting proper content generation?
And by proper content generation, you mean?
Well, who gets to be the arbiter of what is truth, I suppose. But I mean, either we're coming from universities, we're coming from, the CDC, that will go back to, the, trusted bodies and where that comes from.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I want to comment on here. First, just acknowledging some of the comments of others on the panel, and Michael, your comment around augmented intelligence, I think, is a really interesting one to think about in this context. How do we give doctors, journalists, the sorts of tools to accelerate their work and do it better, faster? And then on the content generation facet of the problem, let me chat a little bit about two. Maybe I'll just give first the broad frame of how we see our role here, which is as a tool that helps, that can help accelerate the evidence generation process and take trusted information from those, from the organizations represented here on this panel, from trusted medical experts, and help share and shape that. And so, in terms of the arbiters and who gets to decide in these sorts of areas, I think it's very important to lean on existing sources of expertise here, and to establish strong collaborations between the sorts of tech companies that have these technologies, that have these sorts of platforms to enable these sorts of conversations to happen. And Laura, I feel like I've missed the thread of your question there.
Well, I think is part of, as we build AI tools, not you're consuming information, but probably there has to be some investment in the generators of information. The people who are generating local news, the people who are, where it's coming from.
Let me try to crystallize a part of this. I'm interested in everybody's reaction to this, because I do feel like there's responding to Michael's comment about augmented AI, I used to be a big fan of that, but I think we're passing through that phase now, because the current version of AI can do its own thing. And so the question of, when you have an AI tool, is it inert in terms of view of what's correct? Is it just synthesizing whatever's out there? Who decides what goes into the mix when it puts the information together? And I think historically, when you look, for example, at doctors, they're busy. So once they gain confidence that something will get rid of the busy work they have to do, they will depend on it and not check it so often. We've seen that historically, with all new technologies that come along. So there's sort of this question, I think, that we're all, at least I'm struggling with, and I think it pertains to all of our, you say, trusted organizations. Is it only going to synthesize information from trusted organizations, or if there's a bigger presence of, I don't know, some non-trusted organization, will that be right in the mix?
We like thinking about augmented intelligence because I think in the medical community, as opposed to the tech community, while we think of ourselves as big innovators and have been, we don't like to move fast and break things in the hospital. The way that happens down in the valley. And we've seen examples of things developed with great intention that unfortunately learn our worst habits or are brittle when deployed in other places. The Epic sepsis tool, that alarmed on 80-some-odd% of patients, once tried in other hospitals and didn't identify real sepsis. The Optum tool, intended to send resources to patients who are likely to get sick and be hospitalized in the next year, that learned a lot about racism in the midst of its data set and diverted all of the resources from black patients to white patients. And we can go on and on. So I think that's why we want healthy skepticism as we look at these cool tools in the years after they're deployed, when sometimes you find these things. Sorry, I'm getting off of misinformation a little bit, but to have the FDA commissioner here to talk about AI, that's fun too.
Well, I would say that, there was a tool, there was a librarian at the University of Colorado named Beal who had a list called Beals List. And you were able to go to this list to find out which journals were pernicious journals. I mean, all of us know, there were lots of articles sent out and trying to find out whether it's a pernicious journal, and he had a set of criteria that he used. Unfortunately, in 2019, there was some donors at the University of Colorado who made him take down the website, and he then left the university, which I think is unfortunate. But there are a lot of those things that we can take and put into practice, right? It's not everything. Well, there are things. I mean, what is the FDA doing to try and put out a statement? I mean, what are you deciding to comment on, or is it that you're not allowed to comment?
There are certain things I cannot comment because they're in play in court, but I'll just say in general, at least there's one strain of legal reasoning that a federal agency should just say the facts, and then it's up to others to decide what to do with those facts. I think Nirav, CDC, many of us, I'll just say, believe that if going beyond the facts goes too far, that's bad. But never having an opinion when there's something that would save lives, like a vaccine, I think is a real problem. And Nirav, you sort of signal that that's, to a large extent, what CDC is there for.
Right.
And it's actually in the FDA statute and its mission. So all this, I think, really is in play. But regulating AI from the point of view of the complexity of it is not something that can be done in a simple regulatory framework right now.
Well, two observations there. One is that in the ether around all of this is a forthcoming case at the U.S. Supreme Court, which, depending on how it's decided, could significantly alter the way in which federal agencies are allowed to make regulations. They go by either the relentless cases, if you want to look them up, or the Loper case. And they will impact, or the thinking behind them will impact how FDA, CDC, the mifepristone case, how a lot of that happens in the future, including the nature of any potential regulations around medical misinformation. The other piece here that I've been thinking a lot about is often in misinformation, we zero in on people, the disinformation doesn't, et cetera. I'm a little less worried about people and a lot more worried about the algorithm, because it's the algorithm that takes a nugget of curiosity and turns it into a hardened belief. And so the algorithm is something that I'm a bit more interested and focused on. That said, it's exceedingly difficult, even at algorithmic changes, to make adjustments that would cure the problem. Slapping a label on something, as Facebook does, unlikely to make a difference because, again, it's predicated on an information deficit model, so on and so forth. So I'm concerned about the algorithm. That said, I'm not sure what the regulatory or even technological solutions might be to it.
Well, one thing about science is there's a level of uncertainty that most people are very uncomfortable with. And it's not flip-flopping. It's just that you think something, you gather more information, you change, and you move. And so that's often magnified in articles and journalism and like, oh, you've changed your mind. Well, no, it's not that you're learning. So I don't know, maybe we should be thinking about an uncertainty index, that there is certain information that is uncertain. That is something that, like, we can use for AI, or what is the veracity of the source, and, what's your uncertainty index, or your, there are ways in which you can think about using the algorithms. And then there are times where there are things that are put out there where there really is very little uncertainty that you choose to respond to. And Jack, I'm going to turn to you about the amazing, op-ed that you guys wrote about mifepristone, which I think, again, it's this case decision about saying that the decision that the FDA did 20 years ago should be overturned is hugely threatening, I think, to the FDA, to public health. So again, and I was surprised that the AMA was so strong on it, but very delighted. But so what?
Don't be surprised. This is not the AMA of 1965. It's okay. So to your first point, I would say we have a problem in our community's larger understanding of science. And this is not a satisfying answer because it's not going to be fixed tomorrow, but going back and actually thinking about who sits on school boards and investing in early science education, it took 30 years to undo that. It's going to take us a few years to redo it. But I think that's important. I'll come to your mifepristone question. So, we mentioned earlier how much these same tactics were used by other groups with disinformation in areas where we didn't expect it. So to all of a sudden, show up at a congressional hearing about what's going on in reproductive health care in the wake of Dobbs and have people claim that physicians are just making up stories about pregnant patients septic after a miscarriage in an emergency department, not being able to get care, and having doctors actually have to call hospital lawyers to say, as a 40% chance of dying enough that under state law I can treat this patient. But literally, we saw mass disinformation about whether that was true or whether that was really just two stories that the media, when we know this is happening every day in half the states around the country. The mifepristone case really keeps me up at night. And similarly, we saw a lot of misinformation here. So the notion that you have, I see we're short on time, so I'll be somewhat brief, that you have a group of physicians in Texas who have never even prescribed the drug having standing to bring this case. That you have a single circuit court judge in Texas with no scientific background upending all of the expertise of the FDA, its employees, the evidence it looks at, and all the people that it brings together to look at evidence. The implications, not just for this drug and its use for both abortion and miscarriage management, but if a judge can do that, what is next, right? Oral contraceptives, HIV drugs, anything created with stem cells ever, including a lot of OTC drugs. So tested on stem cells even. So this is incredibly reckless. And this is why we as an organization have stood up. We briefed in the circuit court, we briefed in the Fifth Circuit, and we'll be briefing to defend FDA in the Supreme Court in the next few months as well. I'll just briefly say, our policy comes from a House of Delegates, which is made up of diverse physicians from every state in the country and every specialty in the country. And they get together twice a year for a week and debate policy, and any physician can bring any resolution they want. And around an issue like this, which is really at its core about who gets to make decisions in exam rooms and in hospital emergency departments when doctors and patients sit down together to make hard decisions, is core to the profession. And even though maybe the issue of abortion itself is a controversial one in the country, and our House of Delegates, which is people from all parts of the political spectrum, it was overwhelming. There didn't even have to be a recorded vote. It was so overwhelming on our position on abortion.
All right, I was going to have audience participation. We have run out of time, and we could go on with this. It's a fascinating topic, and I think we can agree that it is critical. So maybe a final question. It seems like we have to work, woe is me is not sufficient. And whether it's street epistemology, aided by or augmented by tools, I think all of the organizations up here could contribute mightily to this solution. And I think we have to believe that there's a solution and a commitment to work together to create it. And so I would like to I'll start with Claire and then come down. That's like, should we get together? Should we get a multidisciplinary multi-agency group together to say that we need to work together to have some trusted tools and sources or a resource for combating misinformation and disinformation. Does everyone on this panel think that that is a good idea and something we should move forward with? Claire, we'll start with you. Yes or no?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of different multi-stakeholder aspects, but I do think there's a need for a community of practice, teaching street epistemology, teaching best practices. We can't be sitting in our silos. We've got to be sharing what's working. So yes.
Great. Nirav?
You can count the CDC in.
Okay. Jack?
Yes, and it's happening already, but we still have to acknowledge that this is a long-term commitment to rebuilding trust in science and evidence. And these are not short-term journeys when we get together as organizations.
I'll give an answer some of my colleagues wish they had given and say yes.
Yes.
And that's a commitment from OpenAI. This is a public good that we can work on, right? Yes? Yes.
It's a commitment to work together
yes.
to figure out what the right solution is and how our tech can best be used.
Rob,
Yeah,
can the FDA help push this idea forward?
I would just say in the world order as it's developing, I still think one of the most important things about this area is that there are federal agencies that have political appointees like me, but are just a few people. The many thousands of people working on these issues are civil servants who have no financial conflict of interest, are there where the mission is the public good. They are charged with making decisions. I thank Jack for the position of the AMA on that. But then I think it's right that there should be limits of the ability of government to commandeer the channels of speech. And so that means in this new world order of the ubiquity of the internet, and by the way, I think there's nothing more glorious than the concept, as is already beginning to happen in Korea, that with a barcode, for example, and a food label, you would get the information at your level of interest and understanding of what's in that label. It could go as deep as needed depending on who you are.
Uncertainty index.
But that same technology could be used to do tremendous harm to people if it's not, regulated but
Well,
we need an amplifier system out there that's focused on getting truthful, reliable information to people, because the government can't do it alone. And I actually believe shouldn't do it alone. Now, my limits might be longer than certain district court judges, but that's going to be adjudicated.
But in the end, you believe that a group like this or representing all these agencies should be working together on a solution to create more trusted resources and tools to
And I know
combat
that
it.
such groups are forming, but also the government.
Not just the
Nirav,
government.
count us in spiritually, but we can't actually be involved in doing it.
Well, not
Your
yet.
spiritual help is all I need.
Not yet. But maybe that's maybe not this Congress. But, I think that, I would say yes. So there you go. The answer is yes. And come next year, and you'll see what we've done.
So, Laura, just one tiny, just
Wait 1 minute.
Yeah,
Yes,
just one.
Michael.
I see Califf, so I'll talk extra fast, and you can take it out of my time next year, Califf. But just one thing I would just say for everyone here, we're speaking of agencies and the government and universities and the AMA, but I think it's also down to us as individuals.
Yes.
I mean, I think we really have to stay engaged. I think we have to not become jaded and cynical. I think we have to not lose hope. I think we have to not be silent. And I think that's the daily work for all of us all along as we move forward into the future.
Right, and include our journalism colleagues because they are the amplifiers of noise and making sure we invest in community journalism. So let's give a big hand for our panelists for a very difficult conversation.
Well said. Great panel. We'll take a 15-minute break and be back at 11:05 when we'll have our first debate on direct-to-consumer advertising.